Okay, I want to dive into a question that people ask me about a good amount, and it's basically just how to practice, how to structure a practice session to get the most effective use of your time. I know a lot of times it could feel like there are so many different areas to cover when you're practicing, and it can kind of get overwhelming, and maybe you don't know where to start or where to, go about structuring your time in the most effective way. And this is something that I struggled with as well when I was in college. I went to college for jazz guitar, and my Mondays through Thursdays were always very busy. I had a lot of classes scattered throughout the day, and I never had like a really nice chunk of time where I could just sit and get a really good practice session in. But I typically always had Fridays off when I was in college. So I came up with this little rubric that I used to structure my practice routines on Fridays, and it worked really well for me. So I will show you what I came up with, and feel free to do with it whatever you want. This can be something that you can personalize based on your own needs and what you think you need to work on the most. But I'll show you what I came up with for myself and see how it works for you. So when I practiced on Fridays when I was in college, I would always try to get at least 3 to 4 hours in. So we will kind of divide it up based on how much time you have to practice, and you can go off of that. But basically, there were like 5 categories that I always tried to hit when I was practicing. So I'll write the categories down, and then we will talk about them, and then we can talk about how to divide up the time accordingly, depending on how much time you have to practice. So the first category would be warm-ups, which can be scales, arpeggios, patterns, etc. The second category would be comping and chord work. The third category would be repertoire. Hopefully I spelled that right. Oh, it looks like I did. The fourth one would be sight reading. And then the final one would be applied technique, practicing soloing, and transcriptions, etc. Okay, so let me go through and just kind of talk about each of these and how I approached practicing them. So I would always start every practice session with a warm up. I think that's very important, especially if you have a good chunk of time to set aside. You want to make sure you get a good warm up in. And most of the warm ups that I would typically do is all of the stuff that I go through in my Scales Deconstructed series. So I would pick a scale or maybe a couple of different scales, and I would run through them in all of the intervals, thirds, all the way up to sevenths, and then be able to go up and down the scale in arpeggios, maybe do that in multiple spots on the neck. And whenever I'm doing this, I'm always doing it with a metronome, and I'm doing it in a couple of different rhythms. So I might start doing the exercise as quarter notes and then switch it to eighth notes, then maybe go to eighth note triplets and then 16th notes. And this is a lot of stuff that we already go over. If you're a patron, I talk about this a lot at the beginning of every Zoom masterclass that we do each month. So it's kind of just taking some exercises and playing them in a variety of different rhythms, and then gradually increasing the speed on the metronome. So I've always been a big fan of that. I think that's really effective. You can also do patterns within the scale, so you don't necessarily have to do intervals and arpeggios. You can do a variety of different kinds of patterns that line up within the scale. That's fine too. Just any sort of thing where you can, get your fingers warmed up. You can do it with a metronome to get your timing nice and spot on. And that's usually a good kind of framework to build your practice routine off of. So I normally start out with that. Let me go through all of these, and then we will talk about how to divide up the time. Then the second thing that I would do is working on chord stuff. So you can practice comping over a standard and, take a variety of different chord concepts and practice doing that. So this is similar to what I do in my chord expansion series. I'll take, some chord qualities and try to build some voicings off of it, figure out different ways to get from one voicing to the next, and then always trying to apply it to some sort of standard or something where I can put it into practice over something that I'm going to be playing in a musical setting, because the end goal of all of this stuff, in my opinion, is to have stuff that you can use in a musical setting, right? Because we're practicing this stuff to play it with other people. So it's important to always kind of keep that in mind when you're working on this stuff. So, in terms of chord work, I would do that kind of stuff, do the inversions of all of the different seventh chords on every string group. Expand upon that, take different scales and run through the chord scales of each scale that we're doing. So in terms of chord work, that's kind of what I would do. Then repertoire, this is a tricky one because it's so vast. There can be so many different songs that you can work on. But I think a general rule of thumb that I always did with repertoire is If you go to jam sessions a lot and you're in, musical like jazz environments a lot, you're going to hear a lot of commonly played standards that a lot of people know. I mean, that's one of the reasons why they're called standards, right? It's the standard repertoire that a lot of people know. And one thing that I used to always do was if I was ever at a jam session and somebody called a song that I didn't know, I would always write it down, and I would just kind of keep a log of all of the songs that I don't know that somebody called on. And then that way, if I'm ever sitting down and I'm working on repertoire, I always have some stuff to draw upon and continue to kind of expand my repertoire. And like I said, this is the most vast area in terms of the practicing because there are so many different standards. But I think it is safe to say there's probably about like 50 to 75 standards that, are probably the most commonly played ones. And maybe I will make a list of some of the most common standards just so you kind of have an idea of where to get started. But I think repertoire is very important. Anytime I have a long practice session, I always try to learn at least one song during that practice session. And for me, one of my favorite ways to learn these songs is, you learn the melody, you learn the chords, but I think it's really helpful and it can be really, it could save a lot of time if you just try to do a chord melody of the song, because then you're learning the melody and the chords at the same time. And if you're able to visualize the melody with the chords underneath it and kind of make the connection between what intervals are happening in the melody over which chord qualities, I think that can really give you a nice understanding of the songs that you're learning. So every song that I learn, every standard, I always try to do a chord melody as I'm learning it, because for me that helps me understand the song, the most inside and out. Then the next thing I would say is sight reading. So this is something that not everybody is a fan of practicing, but I think especially if you want to be a professional musician, I think reading music on guitar is very important and something that you should always set aside some time for, because it's probably the most boring thing on this list, but it is very important. Like I said, especially if you're going to play in a professional setting too. You always want to be able to be in a situation where somebody could put music in front of you and you're able to play it back. You don't want to have any limitations when it comes to stuff like that. And guitar is definitely one of the harder instruments to, learn note reading on, because unlike pretty much every other instrument, the guitar, you could play one note in like 4 or 5 different spots on the neck, which can be very challenging. It's tricky sometimes to know exactly which positions to play in, which fingerings to use. And I think just practicing sight reading in general is very important for that. So this can be through a wide variety of different sight reading books. There's this one book that I really like to work out of by Tom Bruner. I forget the exact name of it off the top of my head, but I'll put a link for that in the comments if you want to check that out. But that book is really good because basically what it does is it takes you through positions on the neck, and rather than writing out these melodies that are in some sort of tonality, it's all atonal stuff, and it's stuff that's pretty much impossible to anticipate what's going to happen next. So it really keeps you on your feet, and it really keeps your eyes on the page to make sure that you're reading the notes correctly. And it throws in all sorts of weird accidentals like E sharps and C flats and stuff that we aren't going to see very often, but it really tries to throw as many loops in as possible to really keep you sharp when it comes to the note reading stuff. Another thing that you can do that's a little bit more fun for some people is, I would say, just open up the real book to a random song and see if you can read the melody. I've done that for a long time. I would always do it with a song that I didn't know, so that way I can't use my ear to try to figure out what's going to happen next. But I think if you can just open up to a random song in the real book and just practice, reading through the melodies, that can help a lot too. And that will also give you a wide variety of different key signatures as well, which is also very important when you're sight reading. And then the final thing would kind of be taking everything that you've done in this practice routine and putting it into practice. So applied technique. So that could be taking some of the scales and arpeggios and patterns that you did for your warm-up and trying to actually apply them into an improvisational setting, taking some of the chord work and the comping stuff that you were doing for the second part of the practice routine and applying some of those chords to a standard, or maybe just trying to come up with a chord melody of something and applying some of these new chord voicings. Because like I said, applying all of this stuff is just as important, because we're learning all of these things. We want to also use them as well. And, coming up with some sort of way to try to apply these things to a playing setting can be really important. And one other thing that I would say that I would also count in this is doing some transcriptions, which is just great for developing more vocab, picking out a solo, learning some of it. And as you're doing transcriptions, one thing that I always did would be, like, if I was ever transcribing a solo or I had an entire solo written out and I was going through it, anytime there was a part where I really liked a specific lick, I would always circle it. And then I would go back and I would just take that one lick and kind of break it down and analyze it and see what's going on. And through that, that can give you some new stuff to apply to your improvisation as well. So you could just take an improvisational concept and try to apply it to some sort of standard. I did a lot of solos out of the Charlie Parker Omni book back when I was in college. And of all of those solos that I've done, if I open up to, the pages, you'll see all of these little circled licks throughout. And a lot of that gave me little great bits of vocab that I really liked the sound of, that I would just break down and analyze and figure out how to kind of incorporate it into my own playing and make some of it more of my own rather than just playing, verbatim a lick from a Charlie Parker solo. So I think, that can be very effective as well. And, pretty much everything that we're talking about right now is more specifically geared towards jazz. Like if you were going to do like heavy metal, like shred guitar practice session, I would definitely kind of structure this differently. But for jazz, I would definitely say that I think these 5 categories will touch on a lot of the bases that you need for a good solid practice session. And of course, there are other things beyond this as well. I'm not saying this is the only way to practice, but this was something that worked for me when I was developing my own practice routine. So now let's go through and just kind of talk about how to divide up the time. So let's say that we have 4 hours to spend on let's do 2, just because, some of the people that are watching this, I'm not sure how much time you're going to have. Let's start with 2, which might be a little bit more realistic for more people. And kind of just go off of that. So if I know that I have 2 hours to spend on this, I'll probably do 30 minutes of a warm-up. The comping stuff, maybe 20 minutes. And so that's 50. Now repertoire, maybe 25 minutes. Sight reading, maybe 20 minutes. So now we have 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 95 minutes. So we have 35 more minutes, I think. 25 more minutes. 25 minutes. That would equal 2 hours right there. And like I said, you can go through and you can adjust this based on what areas that you think you need the most work on. So maybe you don't need to spend as much time on comping. Maybe you don't need to spend as much time on repertoire. Everybody has different areas that they, need to work on more. So I would, adjust accordingly. Let's just kind of, for the sake of just kind of having a couple of different rubrics, let's say that we had a 3-hour practice session. Then I would kind of just go through and I would modify these based on how much more time I feel like I need. So let's say I feel like my warm-up is fine at 3 minutes, but I could use some more work on comping. Maybe change that to 40 minutes, maybe double that. Maybe repertoire, maybe give that another 15 minutes as well. Sight reading, maybe I'll do another 10 minutes. And then what do we got? 60, an hour 40, 2 hours and 20, 34. So I can switch this to 40 minutes, right? So it's just a big game of going through and kind of picking, which areas you really want to spend more time on and adjusting it based on that. And this works really well if you're the type of person that likes things that are really regimented and you can work really well under structure. I've always been that kind of person. My mind works really well when there's structure. I know not everybody is like that. So for some people, kind of having a very tedious outline like this that you follow minute by minute might not be the most practical thing, but, just feel it out and, do, like I said, whatever feels like would be the most effective use of your time. So in terms of, just structuring a practice routine, this is kind of the rubric that I always followed ever since I was in college, and it's worked well for me. And at this point in my life, I don't have as much time to practice as I'd like, but anytime I do have a nice chunk of time to set aside, I'll usually always default to something similar to this rubric. So hopefully that answers some of your questions and gives you a little bit more of a kind of clear rubric as to how to move forward in your practicing. So hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you got something out of that. Thank you for watching, and good luck with your practicing. Take care.